Hello and welcome to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Aidan Muir and I'm here with my co-host Torwen Eerkens, and this is episode 255 where we're going to be doing another Q&A. And as a bit of the behind the scenes as to why we're doing a Q&A, we're both busy people and got a bit on, and we had a compressed schedule for prepping for this one. And we made a promise after the last one that we weren't going to do too many real difficult ones for us to prep for. So Q&As are always easy, and I like to think that they provide value in another way as well. And as I always say on this, the stats show that people listen to this at least as much as the other ones, if not more. So keen to do more of them. So
let's get started. Aidan, I'm going to ask you the first question. How long should you stay in a deficit before moving to a maintenance break?
So there is no right or wrong here. I do have my own thoughts, but I don't like putting them too strongly on record because there are many ways you can do this. So I'll share my own thoughts and I'll share why I think what I think, but then I'll also explain why I wouldn't want this to be a hard rule. I think most deficit phases should be 8 to 12 weeks. And reasons why I think that is because there is a cost associated with being in a deficit. There are downsides. And there's downsides to achieving that deficit as well as attempting to be in the deficit and not achieving it. So I don't want to turn into too long of a list, but there's some physical changes, people become hungrier, their desire to eat increases, there's a decrease in metabolic rate, there's a decrease in incidental movement in many cases, and then there's psychological changes partly related to the restriction and a variety of other reasons. And even the longer the timeline gets, the harder it is to kind of manage things in terms of, there is this saying that you should never start a diet that you can't stick to for the rest of your life. I have a tweak on that where it's well, I don't intend on being in a 500 to 1,000 calorie deficit for the rest of my life. I can make a few more sacrifices during that 8 to 12 week period. But the longer the timeline gets, the more it's well, I have a certain way I want to live my life. I kind of have to line this up with that as well. I won't go too deep into that, but with the whole idea of maintaining weight, I think it matters far more what you do after the deficit than during the deficit. But for a variety of reasons, I think if you spend 8 to 12 weeks in a deficit, then have a period of time at maintenance, it can kind of reset a bunch of this stuff, set you up for another phase if you want to do another deficit. Why do I not want to put a hard limit? Because there are so many people in this world who succeed with much longer deficits than that. There are people who, with a lot of weight to lose, who stay in a deficit for an entire year, and then they can maintain that afterwards and get really good progress. And I'd hate to have somebody who's on a journey, doing a really good thing, hear me say 8 to 12 weeks is the limit, and then they stop it, and it just breaks their momentum or whatever. So you do whatever suits you, but these are my thoughts on what would be most likely to be beneficial for most people.
And I think that's something that we would assess as a case-by-case basis with clients anyway. And if there are events coming up, or whether they're going on holiday, or there's always reasons where that date can change, or whether their goal is shorter term anyway, it makes a lot of sense that we don't stick to a very specific limit.
Yeah, and there's so many of my clients who are currently in deficits longer than that. I'd hate for one of them to be listening to this being hang on, hang on.
What's he saying?
Yeah. So the next question for you, Torwen, is should you put creatine in a hot drink?
This is a good question, and short answer is yes, you can. Creatine monohydrate is actually fairly stable in heat, so adding it to something like coffee or tea isn't necessarily going to destroy it completely. The issue does lie with prolonged exposure to heat, because over time it can actually convert to creatinine, which isn't necessarily the useful form for performance. So my simple tip would be if you're having it in something like that, drink it pretty soon after mixing, within the 10 to 15 minutes, or if you're a bit more concerned, let your drink cool slightly before mixing it in. An upside that I will say is that creatine actually does dissolve sometimes better in warmer liquids. So for people who really don't like that gritty texture, if you're having it in a cold drink, it might be a little bit easier to take. But regardless, at the end of the day, consistency matters most with creatine. So if you're adding it to your morning coffee and that's how you remember to take it, it's probably better than not having it at all.
So I was recording with Tyler this morning, and these won't line up, the releases of these, but shout out to Insights of Ideal Nutrition. Shout out to Insights of Ideal Nutrition. And we'll talk about creatine this morning, and we're even talking about the fact that you could actually get cold water, warm water, put them next to each other, mix in creatine, and you'll see a difference. You'll see it dissolves so much better. That can potentially reduce gut issues as well. Another thing you touched on there was coffee, and some people have concerns that creatine and caffeine can interact in a way that is negative. My personal 2 cents is that it very likely doesn't matter. There are a lot of people who have mechanistic explanations as to why. I think one of the things that, this is my own philosophical kind of way of looking at it, is we only have so many easy wins in the world. So it's you would think if creatine gives a 1 to 3% benefit, caffeine gives a 1 to 3% benefit, you add them together, you get a 2 to 6% benefit. I just think stuff like that just doesn't really happen in the real world. So it's not that they cancel each other out. It's just that I think there's only so many easy wins. But the shorter way of saying that as well is I just think they're not getting in the way of each other either. It's not like it stops creatine from working.
Yeah. Lovely. So, Aidan, your next question then. Can you elaborate on why German creatine is not superior? In brackets, we've got Creapure specifically.
Did you say collaborate or elaborate?
Elaborate.
Can I collaborate?
Can we collaborate on the idea as well?
So, I don't think this is a hot take, but I don't think any individual country would have a monopoly on the ability to manufacture one synthetic product in a way that's superior to everything else. So, like, I just kind of reject that notion. I don't know if that's viewed negatively by anyone, but like I don't think that's a hot take. But I'm going to explain where this kind of idea comes from and then explain why I think it's not better. And the reason why this question came up was because on one of my Q&As on Instagram, somebody just asked the question, is German creatine better? And I just said no. But I'll give more context. So to start off with, the main reason why people would think it's better is that although creatine itself is safe, the manufacturing process could cause unwanted byproducts. Some of these byproducts is creatinine, which could occur due to poor processing or storage, a thing called DCD, which is a precursor used in some production methods that could remain in the final product, and DHT, which can occur in low quality synthesis. The next obvious question should be, how common is this? And although I did mention the country thing, a significant portion of the world's creatine supply actually does come from China, so it largely does come from a single country. No, significant, not almost all, but a significant portion. While many of these Chinese factories produce high-quality creatine, it's usually like 99.9% pure creatine, which is very, very good, and matches what Creapure is, which I'm going to talk about. But the oversight and quality control can be variable between manufacturers. So Creapure, which is what the German creatine that most people are referring to is known to have strict standards and testing to ensure purity. So I can see the logic. Like if you're somebody who's like, well, I don't want byproducts in my creatine, I agree. That's a fair enough belief. But let's go deeper. The argument against it being better, the most obvious one. From an outcomes perspective, it just doesn't work better. That's real simple. It is a lot more expensive and it also does not work better. Most people wouldn't make that trade unless there was other major downsides. If you have something that's 99.9% pure, it will lead to the same results. And the vast majority of reputable brands, including places like Bulk Nutrients, which is where a lot of people will be buying from, achieve purity levels of 99.5 to 99.9% pure. They almost all do testing for DCD and DHT and come out well below safety thresholds. So it's like not really that big a concern for reputable brands. And if somebody was to ask a follow-up question of like, what is a reputable brand? I'll just say something that has like a decent customer base. Like it's not just like one of the smaller brands. Creatinine levels are typically low because you might have noticed I skipped over that. And even if it wasn't, in the amounts that it's found in, it's very safe. It's more just like a quote unquote dead byproduct where it doesn't give any benefits. But if you use like the tiniest bit high dosage of creatine, you get around that problem. So that's my kind of argument for why German creatine is not superior.
The cost one's probably a big one for me because I think if we're recommending things to clients and they're extremely expensive, it's harder to come by. There's no real reason to be taking Creapure.
Yeah, it's hard to make an argument for like, because I think it's like 3 times more expensive. Like I think it is. It's hard to make an argument be like, hey, pay 3 times more and it will give no better benefits. Like, so the next one is somebody asked that they're getting full quickly on weight loss medication, how to maintain adequate fibre.
Again, this is something that we're probably seeing more and more in practice with a bit of a rise of weight loss medication. So as a bit of background, weight loss medications slow gastric emptying, and that's how they help reduce appetite, which is why people can support weight loss. So it can make it harder to get enough nutrition in, especially things like fibre. So my thoughts here are just being a bit more intentional about what you're eating and when you're eating it. So a few things that I like to focus on are making sure that you prioritise a bit of fibre-containing foods earlier on in the day. Often this is when appetite is usually a bit better. You've had the whole night to digest the previous food, and often there is a little bit more appetite there. Second, probably choosing a few more compact fibre sources. So things that give you a fair bit of fibre without necessarily heaps of added meal volume. So that could be things like berries or a little bit of fruit, nuts and seeds, and small portions of legumes as well. Because often it's those big bulky salads that, yes, contain a good amount of fibre, can be just too filling and uncomfortable to eat. So then spreading that fibre across the day rather than trying to get it all in at one meal makes it a lot more tolerable as well. So with that, keeping fluid intake as high as possible or nice and high, just to make sure that you're not making constipation or any of those gastrointestinal symptoms worse.
Fibre supplements as
That
well.
was going to be my last little thing. So in some cases, I definitely might also consider adding something like a psyllium husk in, but that is a little bit more individual on whether or not you need that. But it can be such an easy way to get a lot of fibre without a lot of volume and without anything added or extra.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. And in the last episode, I was kind of talking about bariatric surgery versus weight loss medications. And I do think that this, to a degree, is a nice benefit of weight loss medications over bariatric surgery, where it's like, I don't know how many people listening have seen like the bariatric portion plates, where it's like half plate goes towards protein, then like a third or a quarter goes towards vegetables, or even more, I don't know. And then there's like the tiniest portion for whole grains and then like healthy fats or whatever. And it's almost like with bariatric surgery, the moment it happens, it's like the whole conversation about how good gut health is kind of goes out the window, because it's like, we can't prioritize everything. Like you can't get all your like protein in and your vegetables and so on and so forth. Whereas at least with the weight loss medications, it's like more challenging, but it's still a relevant conversation to be like, can we still try and get all of this through food where feasible too?
Yeah, absolutely. If cooking or cooling carbs increases resistant starch, does that mean active people should increase their overall carbs to account for this?
I don't think so, but I will explain where the question comes from. So regular starch or forms of carbohydrate have 4 calories per gram. Resistant starch has 2 calories per gram. When you cook and then cool certain carb sources, like potato, rice, pasta, some of the starch converts to resistant starch. So you could make the logic of being like, for people who are looking to lose weight, they'd be like, that's a nice bonus. Like there's less calories in this. And there's also gut health benefits from that too. But if somebody has come from that kind of background and is then looking at being like, hang on, I'm an athlete, I'm trying to hit like higher carb needs, should this change? I really don't think so. And adding context, it's really not a huge conversion. In 100 grams of rice, if you went through this process, only a few grams end up as resistant starch. Let's say it was 3 grams. That total difference is 6 calories. I just wouldn't think about it.
It's such a small number. Yeah.
So then somebody asks, are IBS specific probiotics better than general ones for IBS style symptoms?
Let's chat through it. So IBS specific probiotics generally contain specific probiotic strains that have been found to be low in IBS patients, or they've been studied specifically for their positive effects. So a few of these are things like Bifidobacterium bifidum, Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus acidophilus are the main sort of ones that we'll see. Whereas a broad spectrum probiotic will still contain these strains too, but at a lot lower doses, and they'll have more of a broader range. So in terms of are they better, I don't necessarily think they are better than broad spectrum, but I think they have different uses. So if you're having IBS style symptoms and you think you already have pretty okay gut health, potentially then I would say, okay, let's trial an IBS style or an IBS specific probiotic. On the other hand, if we're trying to improve overall gut health, there's been any history of antibiotics or the fact that your gut health might just not be up to scratch, we might start with something a bit broader to introduce a greater array of probiotic strains. Regardless, trial one probiotics supplement at a time, stick to it for a minimum of 4 weeks, and if you don't see any improvements after around 12 weeks, then I would probably stop.
Love it. No notes from me.
Lovely. Well, Aidan, are greens powders of any value for very fussy eaters?
So viewing it from a positive perspective, it can be a little bit of a nutritional safety net in that it helps cover some gaps. In many cases, I do have a preference for a multivitamin, but greens powders could still play a role, particularly if I was viewing it through that positive lens. They are high in a lot of micronutrients, and they can also contain fibre in some cases, so that's a nice bonus too. The negative perspective is they usually have a lot less fibre than if you were to get it from plants or just through vegetables as well. And even if they didn't, it is often largely fortified through 1 to 2 sources, whereas getting it through whole vegetables leads to more diversity, which is usually a good thing for gut health. They're also going to be way less filling, and there's a few other negatives, but if you added them for somebody who otherwise wasn't going to eat enough vegetables, I still think it's a positive overall.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also often ask if clients are considering that for either their kids or that sort of thing, is how are you going to be taking it? If you're putting it in a smoothie, could you honestly just put the real deal in the smoothie anyway? Because it would save you a lot of money, and like we said, you'll probably get a bit more fibre through that way as well.
That's valid. And I don't know, I'd be curious on, because we don't get feedback on the podcast, but I'd be curious on people's takes about, like, if somebody was a fussy eater, like, how do greens powders go down? Like, are they likely to enjoy them? Like, I don't know. Have you tried green sprouts yourself?
Only like the pineapple flavoured little sachets that I get as a bit of a taster, but not personally, no.
Yeah, I've tried a few and like some are pretty gross, and I'm not picky in any way. So if I'm saying that, I'm actually just curious. If anyone wants to give me feedback, in my Instagram DMs. But yeah, what should you do if you suspect an intolerance, possibly gluten or dairy/lactose?
This is honestly another really good question and probably actually quite applicable if anyone's listening along and you suspect that you have some issues this way. The first thing I would say is don't cut foods out straight away. If you're thinking it might be gluten, it's actually really important that you go and see your GP, get tested for celiac disease first, because for this test to be accurate, you need to be eating gluten regularly. So if you've already cut gluten out, the tricky part is that you might need to reintroduce it before you can do the testing. Otherwise, you will get a false negative result. And honestly, that just becomes a whole nother challenge. So go and see your GP. Now, when celiac disease is ruled out, some people might experience what we call non-celiac gluten sensitivity. It's a little bit less defined, and sometimes it's not actually the gluten itself, but it's other components in these foods like FODMAPs. So if this is you, I recommend chatting to a dietitian who works in this space. On the other hand, lactose intolerance is actually quite common, and that happens due to reduced lactase enzyme activity. For most people, it's dose dependent, so they can often still tolerate small amounts of lactose, yogurt or hard cheeses. That sort of thing is normally okay. But generally, using lactose-free products is actually a pretty easy thing to trial. So my suggestions there are reduce that one thing at a time, track your changes in symptoms. If you notice that you feel heaps better or your bowel movements are more regular, more formed, maybe that's the answer for you. But if you're curious that's the case, your symptoms are resolved, I always say maybe it's worth doing a bit of a test again afterwards, reintroducing it. If you've got confirmation, then that makes a lot of sense.
I'm really big on trying to differentiate between lactose and dairy intolerance just due to the prevalence, because such a massive percentage of the world is lactose intolerant. And there are a lot of people who will just write it off as dairy in general. And I don't know why I care so much beyond like the nutrients and stuff like that. And also just like I don't like restriction where it doesn't need to be. But it can be really easy to test for the difference between the two. Like we do have lactose-free milk, and it's like, it wouldn't be fun if you were lactose intolerant, but what you could do is day one, have a lot of regular milk, see if you get symptoms. Day two, assume you got symptoms on day one, have lactose-free milk, see if you didn't get symptoms. If you didn't get symptoms on day two, you're probably pretty confident. If you really want to check again just to see like what if something went wrong on day one or whatever, repeat the cycle. You do that twice, and that's actually genuinely the best way to test. Like they don't do breath testing or anything anymore just because the accuracy rate was not ideal. This would be the best way to figure it out. And I have a big preference for somebody. If somebody feels like they're dairy intolerant but they've never like done this test, I would do that just because it could give you more options.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Keep the background nice and stable. Don't go changing lots of other factors at once, because otherwise, again, it becomes quite unclear what's going on. So, Aidan, should I start a diet at a more aggressive deficit and then reduce it at a lower body fat percentage?
So I've only seen a few people talk about this, and it's like totally fine. Like you can do it. I view it as a personal preference thing. So the logic makes sense. So it's kind of that deficits are easier at the start and the hardest at the end. There's a lot of reasons why. I think literally what I said earlier in this podcast makes sense in terms of the changes in hunger, metabolic rate, steps, or just incidental movement, desire to eat. It's easier to push harder at the start. So it's like, okay, well, let's go lower calorie at the start. When things get harder, let's go higher calorie and kind of ease off a little bit there. It makes sense. Same thing with muscle retention. It's easier to maintain muscle when you have a higher amount of body fat than it is as you get leaner as well. So that makes sense. But that said, I haven't actually seen many people do it and get better outcomes frequently with this approach. And I have suspicions as to why I think that could be harder in some ways too. One of my thoughts is the deficit is at its hardest at the end. And if you feel like you're easing up by like raising calories or whatever, it's kind of hard to be in that mindset. I don't know. I've got a lot of thoughts about that. But I like to view it as a personal preference thing. You could achieve the same goal in multiple ways. So if you wanted to do that, you can try it and see how it goes.
Another thing that maybe we weave in there as well is if you're starting at a higher body weight and it's a more aggressive deficit, then as you lose weight, it's going to naturally be less of a high or aggressive deficit anyway.
The size of the deficit shrinks, which is super valid as well. And I also think that's a small portion as to why this becomes less often to be used as well. But interesting. So the last question we've got, why does appetite increase during certain phases of my cycle? Do I actually need to eat more?
So changes in appetite during certain phases of your cycle is super normal, and in many cases you actually can include a little bit more food. So it usually happens in the luteal phase, or the week or so before your period, and it is actually a time when progesterone is a little bit higher, which increases appetite, and your body is actually preparing to use a little bit more energy for menstruation. So roughly around the extra 100 to 300 calories per day generally. This is also when you might notice more cravings, so things like carbs or chocolate, and it's not necessarily random, but it often actually is somewhat physiological, like your body is wanting to have energy-dense foods. So I always tell my clients we can lean into it slightly. There's absolutely no reason to go overboard, but potentially adding a tiny bit extra to meals or including an extra small snack can help during that phase.
Incredible. Cool. Well,
we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been check my notes. It's been episode 255 of the Art of Nutrition podcast. So as always, if you could please leave a positive rating and review, we would massively appreciate that.